Right, good morning, everybody. It's 15:15. I think we'll make a start. This is scheduled to be the last meeting before we have a month or so's break. And we're going to wait and see what is possible for September. I do pass on the many comments that I get after every week. I get a stream of emails from you lot saying how much you enjoyed it. And I do take great pleasure in passing those on to Judy. So they don't just go into the ether. They are noted, and we do appreciate it. I do appreciate the gentle way in which my errors are pointed out. And as Marion Farrell said, I could have done a Captain Mannering and said, I'm glad you noticed that. It was a test, which it wasn't. It was a mistake. Anyhow, welcome to our last session. And as usual, if you'll just bear with me a second, I'll change chairs with Judy. I'm just pausing a moment. Peter Cooley asked me to inquire whether any or how many of you had had a chance to look at Judy's Desert Island discs that he circulated. But I'll come back to that at the end, and you can tell me then, because we've got you all muted at the moment. So bear with me, I shall change places. In.
Is that here? No. Ooh. Oh yeah, yeah. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all and hear you all. And I hope you're all staying well. To start by answering a question, Rose, I think, or Rosie, asked what happened to, referring to the last lecture, what happened to those Americans who had supported Great Britain against the Patriots, those fighting for independence? What happened to the ones who had stayed loyal? They were called loyalists. They'd stayed loyal to the crown. 1 in 6 of the colonists had remained loyal to the crown. Many were beaten up by gangs, which you could anticipate. There was a great deal of bloodshed in the south, in the plantations. 50% went to Canada and settled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where land was available and they were welcomed. Some went to other parts of the empire, and many came to Britain with the retreating British army. They just came, they came back with them. Because we don't have a census until 1801, we don't really know what happened to them, but they were sort of absorbed into the population seamlessly, it appears. 60 to 80,000, pardon me, left the United States because they did have a kind of census. It's said that the reason the Canadians speak with American accents is because of all these loyalists who arrived in Canada. They came in 2 waves, and the first group were welcomed virtually with open arms. The second wave, the ones who waited to see what would happen to them after the war, decided that things weren't too good for them. They were being discriminated against and beaten up. Then they decided to go to Canada, and there was not welcome on the mat. They were resented. They were treated as unwelcome refugee immigrants, and they had a pretty tough time. They were put into very, very poor accommodation. They were kept shut. They weren't allowed to have jobs, or they were if they tried to get a job, it was resented. They were taking jobs off the indigenous, the people who'd already settled, and they had a pretty difficult time. They were short of food, short of clothes. They were given cast-offs by not the indigenous people, the Canadians, and they didn't have a good time settling in, and they were regarded as intruders. So that's the answer to that question. Right, the king's malady, which is a quote from the doctors. That's what they called it. They didn't call it an illness, they called it a malady, which is quite a nice word to use, an 18th century word for illness, and it covers a multitude of sins. It could be all sorts of illness, a malady. So reasons for the king's, well, we'll call it madness, although we are going to discuss that, whether it was madness or not, or whether it was a condition. Possible causal factors: years of strict self-control. The king was known for his self-control compared with the rest of his family, certainly his father and his grandfather. For example, he never appeared to lose his temper. He sulked a lot, but he didn't raise his voice and appear to get angry with people, even when he was absolutely furious. He bottled it up. Many people found that admirable. They didn't like the sulking, but they found the fact that he didn't lose his temper as his grandfather had done. His grandfather, George II, had a vile temper. But it was a form of repression. He remained faithful to his queen, unusual. Most of his relatives had mistresses to demonstrate how manly they were. The king was absolutely puritanical when it came to food and clothing, and he was the exact opposite of an extravagant monarch, and very economical, puritanical, and repressed. Political changes, well, political stress, too many prime ministers, too many changes of government, an attempt to control his governments, and some people thought that it was that had brought him to a state of collapse, of mental collapse. Certainly the loss of the American colonies troubled him deeply. He never actually said it was his fault, but people at the time and since have thought that he did feel that perhaps he could have done more, although it's hard to know what he could have done differently, that he felt responsible, but he certainly grieved about the American colonies, the loss of the American colonies. He took that very much to heart. The death of his 3 last-born children certainly had an effect on him. He loved all his children when they arrived, but he had a particular love for Prince Alfred, who was a delightful child, apparently. He died when he was 2. And he said when Prince Alfred died that the king said he could hardly bear it, but he would certainly go under if anything happened to Octavius. And then Octavius died not long afterwards, aged 4, who was definitely the favourite child. Everybody loved little Prince Octavius, called Octavius because he was the eighth boy. And everybody loved him because he was a sweet-natured child. And he died. And then later, in 1810, Princess Amelia died, and she had been the sweetest natured of all his daughters, and she died slowly and horribly and painfully of consumption of TB. And that coincided with his last major breakdown, from which he never recovered, when they introduced the regency. And there was no way that the king was going to recover and be able to reign properly again. And then deteriorating relationships with his adult sons, especially the Prince of Wales. We mentioned this before. The king, unusually for royalty or the aristocracy, had a very good relationship with his children when they were little. He loved them to bits. And unusually, he played with his children and talked to them and openly showed affection for them, which was really quite unusual in those days. But he didn't like them to grow up. He liked them to stay little and affectionate and sweet, and we'd say cute. And really, Robert, like a lot of parents, he found it very difficult to cope with them when they started to have minds of their own. We've already said that he didn't want his daughters to get married, and that was seen at the time as eccentric. But we wonder now, people have wondered now, whether there was something really wrong with the king's mind, that he thought it was acceptable that he didn't want his children, he didn't want his daughters to marry. He just wanted them to stay in the family group because it made him feel good. So very, very selfish, actually, very selfish, totally lacking in imagination. And very much like Queen Victoria, attempted to control his sons. She tried to control her sons with disastrous effects, really. Very similar thing that happened, of course. The more the King and Queen Victoria tried to control their sons and say that they had to be just exactly like the parents and live puritanical lives, the exact opposite happened. They became wild and disobeyed their father in every possible way. The only son that he had any time for, once had grown up, was Prince Frederick, Duke of York, who was used as a kind of moral stick to beat the others with. Why can't you be more like your brother? And then, of course, the king found out that he was as bad as the others. He got a mistress called Mary Ann Clark, and she was busy selling. She was totally corrupt. She was selling commissions in the army. It became an absolute national scandal, and of course he was complicit. So he fell off the moral high ground. He fell off his perch. The Prince of Wales, absolutely disgraceful behaviour. It was as though he's going out of his way to be the exact opposite of his buttoned up puritanical father. He was wildly extravagant, didn't understand he didn't understand money at all, just got into debt all the time. Hugely in debt. He enjoyed gambling, which his father despised and thought was dreadful to waste money in that way. Prince of Wales absolutely loved gambling and gambled high, lost lots of money, didn't care. Loved late nights, eating, drinking, lost his looks quite early on in the proceedings, put on a lot of weight, and was nicknamed the Prince of Wales without the H. Sorry, with an H. W-H-A-L-E-S, the Prince of Wales, because he put so much weight on, because he loved his food. Again, contrast to his father. He loved keeping up with fashion. If he ordered one waistcoat, he would order 10 waistcoats. Had no concept of the meaning of money or being careful with money. Absolutely no idea about that. Never did seem to get the hang of that at all. Sexual encounters, promiscuous, mistress after mistress, falling in love, falling out of love. Father and mother were in absolute despair. And the other sons would take mistresses, and then the daughters, in desperation, when they reached their 40s, either married out of people that were unsuitable or actually had affairs, and one of them actually had a baby out of it. It was just so awful for the king to watch his family falling apart when he'd gone to such trouble to try and control them. He couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. He'd set them such a good example. He and the Queen, such a wonderful example, and it hadn't worked. And that really had played on his mind because lacking in imagination as he was, he couldn't see the connection between the restraint that he placed, particularly on his sons, keeping them short of money, thinking, oh, that's a really good idea. I'll keep them short of money. They won't go far wrong if they haven't got any wherewithal. Well, they just borrowed money. They got into debt. They gambled to get money. He just hadn't got any imagination at all. He couldn't, pardon me, he couldn't empathise or understand where he was going wrong. I'm just going to read the list of children in order, so you can start feeling sorry for poor Queen Charlotte. So, George, later George IV, born 1762, Frederick born in 1763, William, Duke of Clarence, 60. I'll just say the family, 65, Charlotte born 66, Edward, Queen Victoria's father, 67, Augusta, 68, Elizabeth, 70, Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, later King of Hanover, 71, Augustus, Duke of Sussex, 73, Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, 74, Mary, 76, Sophia, 77, Octavius, 79, Alfred, 80, and Amelia in 1783. 15 children born to King George and Queen Charlotte within the space of 21 years. Oh, joy. Can you imagine? At the end of all that, virtually a baby every year, Queen Charlotte was getting pretty fed up. And had made it clear that she did not want any more. This is how lacking in imagination the king was. He said, oh, no, we want more. I'd like twins. Unbelievable. And that just shows you what an unimaginative person he was. He wasn't having the babies. His poor wife was having the babies. And she had finally decided that she didn't want any more. And the only way for that to happen, because they didn't have any form of contraception, was to sleep separately. So when the king had his breakdown, people immediately looked for a scapegoat. Oh, the Queen's fault. Rotten woman. She's insisted on separate bedrooms. What a nasty, mean thing to do to such a lovely man. Not thinking perhaps she'd like a rest after 15 babies. And the other suggestion, which is relevant, and a lot of people at the time said that the king had his breakdown because he was married to such an ugly and unattractive in every way, an unattractive wife, that she was ugly, and he'd stuck to her, he'd been so faithful and so wonderful, and it had all been really stressful because she was so ugly. He'd really rather have been having a great time with mistresses, and particularly, he didn't want to marry her. It had been an arranged marriage, and she was ugly, which is also horrible, because she wasn't ugly at all. While we're on that point of sort of royal gossip, you probably come across the idea, which is very current, that she was black, and that she had black ancestry. Therefore, if you Google this, you will, one of the things that'll come up will be Charlotte, England's Black Queen. Well, ignore that, because it arose because when she arrived in this country, excuse me, in her teens, very young, and of course everybody wanted to have a look at her and see what she was like, and somebody said she had mulatto features. They were being spiteful. But she had rather a full mouth, which wasn't fashionable in those days. She had to have a tiny mouth. And she had a flat, they said, a flat nose. Well, the portraits show her with a tilted nose, but wide. And so what they were saying was that she had some African features. And mulatto meant that in those days, mixed race. So it was an attempt to describe her features, not suggesting that she actually had a black ancestry. But the idea kind of caught on, and even some modern historians have followed that through to see if in fact there could be any truth in it. And there isn't. It was simply the way she looked, that she hadn't got fashionable looks. You were supposed to have a Grecian profile, a straight nose. You weren't supposed to have a nose that was tip-tilted or flattened or squashed looking. Somebody said her nose looked squashed. Very rude. But if you think about Jane Austen, how detailed the descriptions of her characters are, people haven't got television or anything to amuse themselves. They did spend a lot of time looking at people and sizing them up according to how they looked. I know that happens today, but even more at that time, very much more, and criticizing people for their looks more than today. So those are the reasons suggested for the king's breakdown. And the first breakdown, which was very hushed up, was 1762. He'd only been king for 2 years. Then in 1765, but the one that you could say hit the headlines was 1788, when in fact he'd been king for 28 years and his family was complete. The last and really dramatic breakdown, because he did recover from the 1788 breakdown after a year and a bit. The last really important breakdown was 1811 until 1820, when he died. And that's what we call the Regency, when he was absolutely, totally capable of reigning or ruling or doing anything. His mind had completely broken down and he was beyond help. So that's what it's called the king's malady. That's what the physicians called it. All the episodes started in the same way, with a cold. Now, in the 18th century, people were very frightened of colds because they often led to, or chills. If a cold led to a chill, it sometimes led to pneumonia, and then they hadn't got any cure for pneumonia and people died. So people were very fussy about getting their feet wet or not getting their feet wet. Again, that comes into Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth gets all wet and muddy, and Jane is ill because she gets wet, and then she ends up being really poorly, if you remember. So our ancestors were really very concerned about getting wet. And in 1788, that's what the king did. He went for a walk in the early morning. He got his stockings all wet with dew, and he went straight into a meeting. He didn't stop to get changed because he was very conscientious. He'd have thought the king would say, everything would stop for whatever the king wanted to do. If he wanted to change his stockings, nobody would complain. But because he was thoughtful, funnily enough, he was very thoughtful about people. He was a good boss, we'd say today. Because he didn't want to keep people waiting, because he was fanatical about punctuality, he went straight into his meeting with wet stockings. So his physicians tended to say, well, it's his fault. What did he expect? It led to a chill and a fever, and then some rather strange symptoms started to appear. Intense internal pains. He can complain with terrible, terrible pains inside his tummy, coughing, chest depression, said he couldn't breathe very well. And he couldn't sleep, and he couldn't eat. And when they tested it, felt his pulse, it was racing. But the most alarming symptom was that he couldn't stop talking really, really fast, almost so quickly that people couldn't follow what he was saying. And it wasn't a conversation, it was a monologue, and it just went on and on and on and on. And he wasn't making sometimes he was talking sensibly, but at great speed, as though he'd been sort of completely wound up. And no pause. He didn't pause at all. became completely hoarse, and that was the only time that he stopped talking, was to have a drink, because his voice, he just talked and talked and talked. On one occasion, he talked for 24 hours non-stop, absolutely not stopping at all. And at that point, of course, the physicians were very, very concerned. They'd never met anything like this. They didn't know what to do. They noticed, and what's great, of course, is that talking 18th century here, late 18th century, the physicians kept notes. And we also have a first-hand account from one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, Fanny Burney, who's credited as being the first woman novelist. She wrote a book which is still in print called Evelina. So she was one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, and she kept a journal with details of the King's malady. And because she was in such close proximity to the royal family, she was able to provide details which are absolutely wonderful, a sort of insight into what it was like from the Queen's point of view. But what it was like from the Queen's point of view was it was absolutely terrifying, because the King demanded her presence, wanted to share bedrooms again. The Queen absolutely adamant that that wasn't going to happen. The physicians sort of say, well, you know, perhaps you can just relax a little bit, because it's making the King even more upset that he thinks you don't love him anymore. She was thinking, well, I know what's going to happen. I'll end up pregnant again. So it isn't going to happen. So that Fanny Burney was sort of in on all that, or she wrote it in a very delicate sort of way. She didn't go into sort of ghastly details about sexual intercourse or anything like that, but she wrote about the stress and the strain and how it was for the royal family, particularly the daughters, the princesses who lived with their parents and witnessed their father being so awfully ill, and they couldn't work. Nobody could work out what was wrong with him and why he wouldn't stop talking. It was just a nightmare. So the physicians noted, and Fanny Burney noted, that the King's face was very, very red. His voice was harsh. Well, of course it was harsh, because he was talking far too much. His eyes were bloodshot. His urine was claret coloured, which is very significant, and we'll come to that. And he had convulsions. He actually had fits. Hardly slept at all, extremely agitated and difficult to manage, becoming more and more violent, and saying very strange things. As days went by and his malady got worse, he started to say very inappropriate things, very, very inappropriate. In a way he'd never done before. He started to swear, he started to blaspheme, and he started to talk in a sexual way, which upset his physicians more than the other symptoms that he was showing. He was acting in such a strange and dreadful way, as though he had become completely demented. And became very angry, very, very angry. And unlike himself, he'd always been sulky rather than angry, but now he was shouting, and he just seemed like, the King just seemed like a completely different person, as though his personality completely broken down, and he was like somebody completely different. And then a rash came out all over his body, and the physicians were really baffled. They didn't know what to do. They tried all kinds of, well, the remedies at the time were fairly limited in scope. They tried all sorts of things. First of all, it was they dealt with his symptoms. He was constipated, what they called costive in those days, C-O-S-T-I-V-E, costive. So they gave him laxatives, and then they decided then he kept complaining about these internal pains, so they gave him laudanum, which, like painkillers today, causes constipation. So the poor physicians were sort of juggling the different remedies, And nothing seemed to be making any difference anyway. The king went on complaining about pains all over, and he seemed to be getting worse. They then used the traditional treatment of bleeding. They always turn to that. If in doubt, take some blood. So they did that. That made no difference. 7 times he was bled. This is in the first outbreak, the first phase of his malady in 1788. Blisters, we'll come back to that, and then drinking from the Chalybeate spring at Cheltenham. And Martin's found a lovely description of explanation about what Chalybeate was, what it was expected to do for patients, and why Cheltenham became so famous. And there was a temporary improvement. The king was well enough to be seen in public, and he drank from the Chalybeate spring, and he said he felt much better. He thought he'd be able to go back to work, and everything was going to be all right. But it was a very temporary improvement. Very shortly afterwards, Fanny Burney and one or two other people who were following the king's progress and taking notes saw something dreadful happen, which was the king talking to a tree, shaking a branch under the delusion that it was the King of Prussia, talking quite sensibly, but talking to a tree. And the physicians, of course, were following the king around. They were letting him have some exercise, letting him out. At first, they tried keeping him in, and that hadn't worked very well. The king had just got incredibly angry. They'd also become very strong, so he was actually struggling with his physicians, and that was a new development. He'd always been so polite and courteous, known for his lovely manners, but now he was fighting, and that troubled them terribly. They didn't know how to deal with that. Some kind of calming measures, but it was very difficult to get hold of him. I mean, today he would have been given an injection of some sort, but they hadn't got any injections in those days. So Cheltenham hadn't really made any difference. So huge setback when he was seen talking to a tree, completely unaware that he was talking to a tree. He thought it was the King of Prussia. He was saying very, very polite, sensible things for the King of Prussia, but
not much response.
The tree. But Martin said not much response, no, which didn't seem to trouble him. He just carried on talking. By this time, his family, the daughters, as they were called, collectively, the 3 princesses, and the king, and the queen, were terrified. They were very, very worried indeed. They didn't know how to help him. The queen was particularly frightened, seeing him in such a state. She was physically afraid of him because he was saying such wild things about breaking doors down and sleeping with his wife again, and how dare you keep me away from my wife, it's my right, and so on. So the queen demanded protection against her own husband. She insisted on having 2 ladies in waiting sleeping in the bedroom with her. The door must be locked, and 2 equerries must stand outside the door and sleep outside the door at night and protect her. That's how seriously ill the king was and how frightened the queen was of her own husband. She was very, very sad. And also the blame attached to her, that people were saying, oh, if only she'd relax a little bit and go back to normal family life, then the king wouldn't be in this state. So the worry was that the physicians were trying to keep all this secret. They were pretending to the outside world that the king was just a little bit ill with the chill, and if he got onto his chest, nothing to worry about. They were terrified that it would become public knowledge, and it would affect the stock exchange. That stocks and shares would be damaged if there was any suggestion that the king was seriously demented, that he was out of it, he lost his mind. So that was another stress, and another problem for the physicians that were dealing with the king, that they must pretend all the time, and they must be seen he must be seen out of doors every so often so that the public would be reassured and the press wouldn't get hold of it. Even in those days, the press was a significant factor. But eventually, his chief physician, Dr. Richard Warren, actually said that the king was all but. And all but meant all but dead. The king was all but. It was an 18th century expression, apparently. All but dead. And it was then decided that they would use a straight waistcoat, which is, I think, the same as a straight jacket. So they had to fight the king, obviously. He didn't just put this on in a kind of meek and mild way. He fought violently, but they managed to get him into a straight jacket. And they then decided that they had better move him and take him somewhere more private, Kew Palace. It perhaps wouldn't seem very private today, but in those days, very, very extensive grounds, and they could keep the public away, and they could treat him in a more satisfactory way, that the public wouldn't work out that these physicians kept calling in. He's got 7 physicians working on him by this time, always slightly different ideas as to how to deal with the king, which wasn't helpful. They were arguing among themselves. So he fought and fought. The poor king fought not to go to Kew. He didn't like Kew Palace. In those days, it was on the edge of London. It's in the centre of London now, but it was, well, not centre, but it's part of London. In those days, it was more remote. Less chance of the public finding out. And the stock exchange being damaged. I mean, that probably seems rather strange today, but it was very important in those days that stocks and shares should be maintained, and there shouldn't be anything that would alarm the stocks and shares situation. So, what to do now they've arrived at Kew, which wasn't prepared. It was a horrible, cold, rather shabby palace. It had been very neglected. In despair, the royal family decided to send for Dr. Francis Willis. They'd heard that there was this guy who was an ex-clergyman, who'd given up being a clergyman, no medical qualifications at all, but that he'd established a really good reputation for curing lunatics. And he'd established a private asylum in Lincolnshire, and it was doing very well. Private patients, of course. And he was having success. And so in despair, the royal family authorised this man to come and take over the king's medical case. He and his son, also called Dr. Willis, although they didn't really deserve the title, they'd sort of taken that upon themselves to call themselves doctors. And Dr. Willis's idea was that patients who were so violent and appeared to be so crazy just needed to be broken in like horses. They needed to be made to behave, that they were self-indulgent. They were running rings around everybody. They needed to be controlled by harsh methods, if necessary, by kind of, like with the donkey, the stick and the carrot, threats and encouragement. And so the royal family reluctantly, very reluctantly, decided to dismiss the royal physician. Well, not dismiss them totally, but dismiss them for the time being. And Dr. Richard Warren, very resentful, of course, as he was the chief physician, and bring in this stranger to see what he could do. And he used various methods which we would now find totally shocking, which he said had worked. Now, one of the beliefs, it wasn't just breaking people in and treating them like wild horses that needed to learn how to have a saddle on their back and then calm down. One of the beliefs at the time, which Willis's did use, was that the brain was sort of loose in the head. It needed to be in balance. And we still say unbalanced when we mean somebody who's got mental health issues. Unbalanced. So one of the methods used was to sort of joggle the brain back to where it belonged, to make it hang level again. And if you remember, many years ago, they would say if anybody committed suicide, they would say this had happened while the balance of their mind was disturbed. So the idea continued, even though we don't believe that anymore. So one method is to put people suddenly into a cold bath, plunge them into cold water. The shock would make their brain go back where it belonged. Or put people in a chair, a wooden chair, and they would lean back comfortably. The back of the chair could be drawn up and removed, and they would fall backwards onto a mattress or a mat of some sort. The sudden shock, again, and the violence would joggle their brain back into where it was supposed to be. It would hang correctly. Or even putting somebody in a room quietly with a book and then suddenly jumping in on them with a loud noise. Anything to shock the mind into going back where it belonged, the brain going back where it belonged. So Dr. Willis certainly used those methods. He used a straitjacket. We call it a straitjacket. They call it a straight waistcoat. A straitjacket as a threat. To calm the person down and then say, we'll take this off when you behave more calmly, when you stop being so ridiculous and saying such silly things, or when you consent to eat something, or if you can say you've had more than 2 hours sleep. So it was very much like dealing with a small child or an animal that you're trying to control, sort of house train. And it gradually worked. Now we know that it didn't really work. It wasn't what he was doing. It was that the king was going to recover anyway, because he had on previous occasions. Although this onset, this attack, had lasted much longer. And just as the Regency Bill was passing for the 3rd time through the House of Commons, because the royal family had reached a state of despair, that this couldn't go on, that the king couldn't sign anything or deal with anything. And therefore, the head of state was out of action, then somebody had to take over. There was even a debate about which of his sons was capable, because nobody wanted the Prince of Wales to take over, because he got such an awful reputation for being totally irresponsible and selfish and clueless in many ways. But needs must. The king wasn't getting any better, and it didn't appear to be getting better. Then, just as the Regency Bill was going through the 3rd reading in the House of Commons, the king began to recover. And every day improved. Ate more, slept more, sounded more rational, stopped this compulsive talking, and was allowed to go out for walks. He was allowed to see his wife and his daughters. It was always a bribe. If you behave yourself, you can see your wife. If you behave yourself even more, you can see your daughters. If you behave yourself even more, you can see them all together and go for a walk together. And that seemed to work. Now, whether he would have recovered, well, we assume he would have recovered anyway, but Dr. Willis took all the credit for this, and he became famous, of course, because he cured the royal patient. And so Martin's found this wonderful picture of the medal that Dr. Willis decided he wanted. He wanted this medal to be produced, showing what a wonderful man he was. And so 1789, because it had taken a year, well, over a year to get the king back to rights, this medal was struck. And Dr. Willis is very cross that he didn't get an absolutely massive pension. He was 73 years old, Dr. Willis, and he was very cross that he only got £1,000 a year for 23 years, because as he pointed out, he wasn't going to last 23 years. So he wanted either a lump sum or a lot more in that royal pension than he actually got. But his son was given a better pension, which would last for longer. It was less money, but the son was more likely to receive the full amount. There were recurrences, unfortunately, of the king's malady. 1795, that was dealt with. 1804, again, exactly the same symptoms, going very red in the face, not being able to sleep, not eating properly, rash, coughing, pains inside. But by 1811, he had also was showing signs of, well, what they used to call senile decay, they called it in those days. I think we can all remember that horrible phrase, senile decay. So how much of it was his malady and how much of it was old age catching up on him? Nobody was able to tell in those days, of course. There were no tests of any kind. And by 1811, he was having problems with his sight, very, very bad problems, and problems with his hearing. He was losing his hearing. And everybody remarked on how old and ill he looked. And his final breakdown was total and irreversible. He was taken to Windsor, and very, very tragically, he spent the last years of his life wandering the corridors and gaining some benefit from playing the harpsichord. He remembered how to do that. Even though he's blind, he could still play the harpsichord, singing and talking to himself. Being well looked after, of course, but absolutely a tragic end. And that, of course, is when the Regency took place. So just to read one or two of the, this is going back to the king trying to control his children. So if I just read this letter, you probably understand why they found their father so irritating and why they did the exact opposite of what their father was recommending. I'll just say, in spite of this is when they were teenagers, in spite of occasional relaxations, such as hunting and riding, attendance at the Queen's, no doubt excessively decorous card parties, visits to suitable plays, the emphasis for the princes was on learning and very little else. The royal children were constantly reminded that their parents expected much of them, too much. The king wrote to the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York in 1778. My dear sons, place ever your chief care on obeying the commands of your Creator. Every hour will show you that no comfort can be attained without that. Act uprightly and show the anxious care I have had of you has not been misspent, and you will ever find me not only an affectionate father, but a sincere friend. May heaven shower the choicest blessings on you both and on the rest of my children. So such sermonizing was no doubt kindly meant, for George III was a kind man at heart, but that was hardly a letter to strike the right response in the Prince of Wales, who was nearly 16 years old and beginning to think of interests far removed from the commands of his Creator. So soon family ties were being strained to breaking point. The Prince of Wales wrote to his brother Frederick in 1781. I'm sorry to tell you that the unkind behaviour of both their majesties, that's his parents, but in particular of the Queen, is such that it is hardly bearable. She and I, under the protestations of the greatest friendship, had a long conversation together. She accused me of various high crimes and misdemeanours, all which I answered, and in the vulgar English phrase gave her as good as she got. She spoke to me, she said, entirely without the king's knowledge. Now I am thoroughly convinced from the language she used and the style she spoke in She must previously have talked the subject over with the king, who wanted to try whether I could be intimidated or not. But when she found I was not so easily to be intimidated, she was silent. So he is a teenager at loggerheads with his parents, and they didn't handle it very well. This is just an interesting little example of how strange some of the boys were, some of the princes were. A strong streak of eccentricity was created in the Hanoverians. A lot of them were presented themselves as though they were a little bit mad, even though they were never diagnosed, it was never suggested that they were mad, but they were very eccentric. So this is Augustus, Duke of Sussex. He erred in it. It goes on about them all having mistresses and gambling and going to what we might say we call today nightclubs, but they were gambling dens. All the princes were guilty of that. Augustus, Duke of Suffolk, erred in a different way. He had escaped the military life because of what was diagnosed as convulsive asthma. So it was very likely a further manifestation of porphyria, which was to attack his father so tragically. And he'd been allowed to improve his mind instead. He had a collection of over 5,000 Bibles and was something of a classical scholar. He was inordinately proud of his singing voice. And this is the bit that comes over as a bit strange. I had the most wonderful voice that ever was heard, he once said. 3 octaves, and I do understand music. I practiced 8 hours a day in Italy. One may boast of a voice as it is a gift of nature. Augustus, though, was also prone to exercising other parts of his anatomy. He was profoundly susceptible to female charms and equally sentimental in their exploitation. He fell head over heels for Lady Augusta Murray, who was described by one contemporary as coarse and confident looking. Augustus was 19. Augusta, or Goosey, as he insisted on calling her, was 30. So that's just a little example of how the royal sons were eccentric and full of themselves. I mean, the boasting is the sort of thing a very small, pardon me, a very small child would do. You know, I had the most wonderful voice that ever was heard. In polite society, that really was not acceptable. And the inappropriate liaisons. So just to say now, one of the problems for the royal family was that the king, early in his reign, had insisted on Parliament passing the Royal Marriages Act, which still applies. Because of George III's brothers and sisters, he was from a big family, they had made inappropriate liaisons, and it was feared that they were bringing the royal family into disrepute. So the Royal Marriages Act said that no one in the royal family could get married without the king's permission. And there are all sorts of other rules and regulations. The men couldn't get married until they were at least 25 and so forth and so on. This was supposed to control the royal family and render it respectable. In other words, princes and princesses would have arranged marriages. They wouldn't go off and find a boyfriend or a girlfriend on their own initiative. Or if they did, it couldn't lead to anything. Which is why they took mistresses, because they couldn't offer them marriage. They didn't want to be they didn't want to be arranged as it. So just say here a sort of funny anecdote. When I was at Alfred Terry, he was a lovely lad. I'm not going to name him. A lovely Asian boy, Indian, very handsome. Everybody thought that one. He really was a lovely pupil. He was a joy to teach, and he was very attracted to my daughter Isabel. But he said on one occasion And she was very attracted to him because he was gorgeous and a sportsman and a lovely lad. And on one occasion he said, "Oh, I can't ask you out, Isabel. I'd love to, and I'd love you to be my girlfriend, but I can't because, as you know, I'm Indian, Hindu, and at some point I'll be arranged." And he meant he would have an arranged marriage. And Isabel sort of fell about laughing, and he was quite offended. And she had to explain that arranged was what in our family we said when we were having our cats either spayed or the male cats sort of rendered infertile. Saying, "I can't ask you out, Isabel, because it wouldn't lead to anything. I wouldn't be able to marry you because I'm going to be arranged." That's why she was laughing. She had to explain, but she was very embarrassed then, having to explain why she was laughing, because he was all upset. And then he was all upset again because she, like too much information, as they say today, too much information. So the royal princes and princesses were told no way could they enter into any liaison or propose to anybody without the original thing was that their brother's permission, but now it was his children who were influenced and affected by this, and it still applies. Apparently, it still applies that the royal children have to ask the Queen for permission to get married, and their partner has to be vetted and approved. Still works. Still on the statute book. So Prince Frederick did marry Miss Augusta Murray, but he wasn't faithful to her. He then found somebody else, and he managed to get rid of Miss Augusta Murray, because it was illegal anyway. It happened without the permission of the king. So according to the Royal Marriages Act, it was a non-marriage, and he then married somebody called Lady Cecilia Buggin. And one of the royal observers at court, somebody called Creevy, said, "Old Sussex comes here on Monday, and Cis Buggin too. Was there ever such a low-lived concern?" There's great contempt for this second liaison, because he hadn't chosen any more wisely than he had for his first partner. So that just shows you that the royal family were not sort of regarded with great respect, regardless of the king's breakdown. The king's sometimes it's regarded as a breakdown, and other times a complete collapse of his health. So this is a description of the some of the symptoms that he had, and how it seemed to people who were observing him. This is going back to before the Willises. The king's doctors were beginning to panic on the realization that they had no expertise with which to treat the alarming symptoms. Sir George Baker, one of the 7 physicians, noted on October the 29th, "I found His Majesty at his concert, not seeming to attend to the music, but talking incessantly. His pulse was 84. He now complained that he was of late becoming nearsighted, that his vision was confused, and that whenever he attempted to read, a mist floated before his eyes and intercepted the objects. He likewise mentioned to me, as a cause of great distress, that having in the morning selected a certain prayer, he found himself repeating a prayer which he had not proposed to make use of." Then it says that Baker decided to call in Dr. William Heberden, but even this distinguished physician was clearly baffled. One of the worst days was November the 5th. Fanny Burney sensed the atmosphere of impending doom which enveloped Windsor. At noon, the king went out in his carriage, with the Princess Royal for an airing. I looked from my window to see him. He was all smiling kindness, but gave so many orders to the postilions and got in and out of the carriage twice with such agitation that again my fear of a great fever hanging over him grew more and more powerful. Alas, how little did I imagine I should see him no more for so long, so black a period. The Queen was distraught, and the arrival of the Prince of Wales did not help. The King at dinner had broken forth into positive delirium, which long had been menacing all who saw him most closely. And the Queen was so overpowered as to fall into violent hysterics. All the princes were in misery. The Prince of Wales had burst into tears. The Prince of Wales, lachrymose at the best of times, had better reason than ever before. The King, according to his son's no doubt somewhat biased evidence, had suddenly leapt upon him, seized him by the collar, and hurled him against the wall. Hungary water had to be applied to the prince's temples, though it is not recorded how the king was soothed. Fanny Burney waited in an agony of trepidation. 2 long hours I waited alone, in silence, in ignorance, in dread. I thought they would never be over. At 12 o'clock, I seemed to have spent 2 whole days in waiting. I then opened my door to listen in the passage if anything seemed stirring. Not a sound could I hear. My apartment seemed wholly separated from life and motion. Whoever was in the house kept at the other end. Not even a servant crossed the stairs or passage by my rooms. Finally, a page boy arrived and summoned her to the Queen's presence. Miss Burney was appalled by what she saw. My poor royal mistress, never can I forget her countenance. Pale, ghastly pale she looked. She was seated to be undressed and attended by Lady Elizabeth Waldegrave and Miss Goldsworthy. Her whole frame was disordered, yet she was still and quiet. These 2 ladies assisted me to undress her, or rather I assisted them, for they were firmer from being longer present. My shaking hands and blinded eyes could scarce be of any use. I gave her some camphor julep, which had been ordered her by Sir George Baker. How cold I am, the Queen said, and she put her hand on mine. Like marble it felt. It went to my heart's core. Fanny Burney hardly slept that night and was up at 6 o'clock. When she saw the Queen, she burst into tears. The Queen, Queen Charlotte, and this is Fanny Burney again, looked like death, colourless and wan, but nature is infectious. The tears gushed from her own eyes, and a perfect agony of weeping ensued, which once begun, she could not stop. She did not indeed try, for when it subsided and she wiped her eyes, she said, I thank you, Miss Burney. You have made me cry. It is a great relief to me. I have not been able to cry all this night long. Apparently, it had been a terrible night. The king had been convinced that his wife had been spirited away and had appeared in her room, candle in hand, to reassure himself. The shock to her had been considerable. They could all hear the king talking away incoherently in the next room, and the physicians attempting to calm him. Once he burst out. Well, this is the king speaking. I'm nervous. I'm not ill, but I'm nervous. If you would know what is the matter with me, I'm nervous. But I love you both very well, if you would tell me truth. I love Dr. Heberden best, but he has not told me a lie. Sir George has told me a lie, a white lie, he says, but I hate a white lie. If you will tell me a lie, let it be a black lie. So that explains, from the point of view of an eyewitness, how awful it was for the royal family and how helpless they felt. And that was when they decided that the Prince of Wales had better take over as regent, and they had better get a different physician or group of physicians, because the king was getting worse, not better. And he'd also become violent and obscene over the next few days. The argument between the physicians was it a fever? Was he demented? Was he physically ill? They couldn't agree. Says Sir Gilbert Elliot, a fervent Whig, was convinced of the king's madness. The physicians talk of fever, but I'm inclined to believe he has never yet had any fever, in the common acceptance of that word, and that they avail themselves of some occasional quickness of pulse to avoid the true nature of his disorder, and also to avoid the declaration of a circumstance which would make his case much more hopeless. I mean that of delirium without fever. So some people said that he had delirium, other people saying that he was delirious because of fever, other people say no, he's delirious because he's gone completely mad and unhinged. Another word that suggests that the brain isn't hanging correctly, unhinged. It's come loose on one side and it's gone sideways. The argument, of course, continues. The argument continues. Theories about the king's illness. The first way of treating his illness was quite primitive, the belief in a humour. What is a humour? Well, it goes back to medieval times. The four humours have to be in balance. And the first treatment was a humour which they said had begun in his legs when he got the chill, when he didn't change his stockings. It started in his legs. And it went then into his bowels, and that's why he had problems, bowel problems. And it says, and this is a quote from the doctor's report, the physicians are now endeavouring by warm baths and great warmth of covering to bring the humour down again into the legs, which nature has originally pointed out as the best mode of discharge. So move from his head down through his body into his legs, where the humour had begun, and then they would blister his legs by using what we call Spanish fly, which is well, if we say they were going to put acid on his legs, we'd understand more. They were going to make his legs poorly, and he would come out in blisters, he would come out in eruptions, the skin would be broken, and the humour would escape. Incredibly primitive. Incredibly primitive. It's way back, going back to the Middle Ages, that the humour was active, and you got to make it go where it should go, how it could, in other words, make it go where it could escape, make it go where it had started, and then go. And in order to do that, you have to break the skin, and then the humour would sort of ooze out of the skin, and the person would be all right again. 1969 was the first suggestion that the king had an actual illness, a physical illness that produced delirium and what appeared to be madness. Porphyria, a rare disease, a metabolic disease that alters the body's chemistry, leading to overproduction of toxins. In other words, the body is poisoning itself. The word means purple because the urine goes purple coloured, it goes claret coloured, like wine. And most people at the time, the historians at the time, leapt on this because they said they'd got the medical records, the physicians were scrupulous in taking his pulse and checking him every few hours and keeping very, 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 very good records, and that his symptoms tick all the boxes for porphyria. The pain, the joint pain, the talking, all of it. But as you probably know, recent theories, revisionism, they've come up with the idea that it wasn't porphyria, he was what used to be called manic depressive, he was bipolar. And as years went by, it got worse. They're not convinced by the porphyria theory. But defenders of the porphyria theory point out that it's hereditary, and they do apparently check all royal children now. They check them for haemophilia, which is also in the family, and they check them for porphyria. And I can remember reading a long time ago when Princess Margaret died that they had seen signs of porphyria in Princess Margaret. So the defenders of the porphyria theory argue that it is hereditary, and that there are medical records going back to the time of Mary Queen of Scots, where the medical men pointed out that her urine was discoloured and that it was reddish purple, hence the name porphyria, Greek for purple. And certainly James I, who had an excellent physician, who kept scrupulous records, and he recorded on several occasions that the king's urine had gone claret, he used that word, claret coloured. So the people who say that the king suffered from that he was bipolar and bipolar disorder, that seems to rather counteract that theory. So I've ended by saying the jury is out, because the jury is out. We can't prove it unless there's some sort of digging him up. Well, not digging him up, taking him out of the royal vault and doing tests to find out what really ailed him. But certainly we can say that the royal family were peculiar, put it mildly, and there's a book which I think I've already recommended called The Strange Brood, which is a good way of describing certainly the sons. Certainly the sons. And just to end with we'll do this next in the autumn when we start again. A poem by Shelley, written after the Peterloo massacre, which is a film now. Some of you may have seen the film Peterloo, but we will be doing this in detail. And the poet Shelley picked up his pen after the Peterloo massacre and wrote. I'll just read the first 4 lines. An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring. It's so disrespectful of the royal family. So I'll leave that with you, and I think with sort of thanks and gratitude for our present monarch, that she is such a good example. You look at her ancestry, so she's 1718 Hanoverian. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good summer holiday, and hopefully we will meet again. Sound like Macbeth. We'll meet again in the autumn. And until then, stay well. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin. See you in September.
Just before you go, just to the question that Peter raised earlier, he hopes that you've had an opportunity of seeing the Judy's Desert Island discs that he sent out to people. If you haven't had a look at it yet, do have a go at it. It is technically a very a good production. Thank you, Peter. It works, and it's interesting to see something of Judy's background and the music that's influenced her. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again somehow, somewhere in September.
Thanks, Martin.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Martin.
Bye.
So, thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.